Hello and welcome to another episode of Hope for You. Whether you're watching online on YouTube or you're listening later on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we love you. Thank you so much for being here. This week's a little different. Pastor John is at a tent revival in North Carolina, somewhere in Carolina at Pastor Eddie's church. So he's gone for the week, so you got me. I'm going to be having some guests this week, and we're going to be talking all about the importance of youth ministry. It's going to be a little different than normal because these aren't necessarily teachings. They're just conversations with some youth pastors and youth ministers that I know. We're just going to talk all about why youth ministry is important. That being said, today I have with me, let me bring him on the screen. Boom. This is Chris. Say hi, Chris.
Hey, everybody.
So, Chris, if you could, first of all, welcome. Hi, thank you for being here. You are a huge inspiration to me, and I look up to you quite a bit, so I just appreciate you being on here today. This is awesome. If you could kind of tell everybody who you are, what you do, where you came from. I'm not saying give us your whole life story, but I'm kind of saying give us your whole life story. So the floor is yours, sir.
Well, it started off, I was born a baby. No, we're not going to go that far back. But my name's Chris. I'm a family ministries pastor here in Evansville at Hills Church. I've been here now for just about 5 years. And so I oversee the nursery, so 0 all the way through even college stuff. On Tuesday nights, we have a small group for that. And so, I oversee all of those animals, beasts, however you want to call them. I oversee like all of that stuff, just trying to make sure that everything works. And so kind of my story is I grew up in the church, grew up with incredible parents who, raised us to follow Jesus. I got called in ministry when I was 12 years old. And so I got hired at the church I grew up in Florida when I was 18. And so I've been in ministry now for 11 years. And so I've kind of been a little bit all over the place. I worked in Florida for a little while. Then I worked in Texas, and I was there for a little bit as a youth pastor. And now I've been in Evansville, for probably 6 or 7 years now. And so that's where I've been.
Sweet. And you're at the Hills right now.
Correct. The Hills Church. Yeah.
And you guys just built that new building. And I know I'd love to hear, this is a good place for like a shameless plug. I'd love to hear, I know you guys have that facility. You can put it in better words than me, but like the playground that's open.
Yeah.
What is that all about?
Yeah, so we wanted to build a building that was like just a gift to the community. Churches are open on Sundays, but usually for the rest of the days of the week, there might be small groups or something else. But what's something that someone in the community who's far from Jesus can come to a place that's approachable, that they can bring their kids, it's free to use. So literally, if you walk into our building, the first thing you see is this giant 4-story playscape. And so it's like McDonald's and all of those things back in the day. And so kids can run in there. There's a coffee shop that's open, man. There's like soccer nets, there's AstroTurf everywhere. So kids can just run around. Like literally, I'm looking up right now and on our giant like LED wall, there's literally just Disney Junior playing. And you just have families just coming in and so that they can just use it. And it's a space that they can use. And what's so cool to see is that people who don't go to church have come into our building, right? And whether they have a prior church experience or church hurt or whatever it is, it takes away that stigma because we've actually seen them then come back on Sundays and be like, this is a place that I'm comfortable with, that, it's not whatever I've experienced in the past. I've met the people there. I'm actually okay coming back. And it's been so cool to see families who've been doing that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was just telling you before we got on, so a little behind the scenes, everyone, but I haven't been over to the new building yet. I'd love to come check it out. But I've seen pictures and I know people that have visited, and it seems really cool. It seems really impactful.
Yeah. It's been cool to see what God's just kind of done with that. I know that's been on, our lead and executive pastors' hearts. It's like, man, really, how can we approach this in a different way just to reach our community in a way where it doesn't feel kind of like a gotcha, where it's just like, hey, here's this outreach event, and then like, now you're at church. But it's really just like, hey, we just want you to come. Right.
Yep.
And then let's build up that relationship over time. And it's been really cool to see the results from that.
That is cool. Yeah. Speaking of church, so again, for everyone listening, thank you for being here. We love you. Don't forget to comment. We're still looking for the 100 comments, even though things are a little different this week. So please run up those comments. I'm going to take just a second. Hi, Brenda. Hi, Mark, Terry, Nancy. Adam Otten is online. What's up, Adam?
Real legend.
He's anyway. Kim is online. Let's see. Nancy's online. Clarissa. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. We love you. So, again, we're talking all about the importance of youth ministry. Of course, those of you that go to Hope City know that I'm oversee the youth here. Chris does at his church as well. And then we're going to have Adam Otten on tomorrow, which most of you know pretty well. And then Thursday, our very own Mark Gerner is going to be on with me, he was my youth pastor growing up. He was in the youth ministry for, I don't know, he can tell us, like 20 years, something. So he knows a thing or two about it. So we got an exciting week. If you have been at all curious about what is youth ministry, what are the teens up to, what are our young adults up to, this is the week for you. So that being said, Chris, I'm going to shoot you some Whoa, my tongue just stopped working. Back up. I'm going to shoot you some questions, and then I'd love for you to give us your best answer, and then we're just going to kind of talk it out.
Yeah, for sure.
But I want to start with, what do you believe are the key reasons why ministering to Gen Z, but also just youth in general, is so important to the general church? Like, why is it so important to reach the youth in the first place?
Yeah, I think it's huge because one, I think kids and students are close to God's heart. I think you see that in Matthew 19:14, right, where Jesus is speaking, little kids run up to him and the disciples start to shoo them away. He's like, no, let them come to me. Like, these children will inherit, the kingdom. And so I think right off the bat, like, God says very clearly, he's like, no, there's something important about the next generation. If it's important to God's heart, it needs to be important to ours, right? But then if you even look at it, like, when you miss the next generation, like, you'll start to see, like, religion start to break down, right? So you even see that in, like, Kings when you read it, right? When Solomon passes the torch and you start going down the, like, line of who's the next king, when they diverted off of God's path, the whole next generation just got worse, right? And so for us, like, youth ministry, like, we're literally trying to reach the next generation so that Jesus continually is passed. Like, it's one thing to run the race, but it's another thing, like, when you're running like a relay, you have to pass the baton to who's next so the race can continue, right? And so for us as youth pastors, like, even just like kids pastors, like, our job is to help take that baton and pass it on to the next generation. Because if not, right, you're going to see more and more generations, like, slip away from Jesus, slip away from their identity, slip away from who they are. And sadly, that's what you're really seeing in culture right now, right? Like, as you're getting more and more unchurched, right? That's what we're seeing in this next generation. This generation, Gen Z, who we're talking about, which is ages 11 through 26, right? But for us, all intents and purposes, we're talking middle school and high school. It's the most biblically unchurched generation that has ever existed. Right? Like, Scott, I'm sure you could probably go up to a kid, because I've done it before, and you talk about a basic Bible story. You're like, hey, who's the guy who had the ark with all the animals? And kids are like, Jesus.
Yeah.
No, close. Or like Moses, or something that's way off. You're like, no, it's actually Noah, right? Like, they don't know even basic Bible stories. So to even try to bring up scripture or who Jesus is so far away from it. And so you're seeing a generation that is trying to figure out something that's real, that's true, that, like, sustains them, that gives them everything that their heart genuinely craves, that God has designed their heart to crave for, but they have no clue where to find it. Right. And so for us, like, it goes back into the whole thing is that, like, we've got to recognize too, is that kids are sponges, teenagers are sponges. And it's so important that we're teaching them, because they're being taught from somewhere.
Right.
That's hands down. I think that's where a lot of, like, I think there's a misconception with, like, parents and just, like, all of that raising your kids, is that, like, your kids are being taught somewhere. And right now, if it's not within church, like, we could have a full monologue and dialogue of priorities and families, and that could be a whole nother conversation for another time. But it really breaks down to it is your kids are being taught something. And so whether it's from social media, whether it's from school, whether it's from ever, like, literally I had a kid who just came on our fall retreat. And she was like, you know what, man, I missed the best day of school. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, they're talking about sex and all this other stuff, like, in, like, school. And I was like, okay, our kids are being taught everything.
Right.
And as it's going on social media, the ages are getting younger and younger, right? And so, like, we have to make the decisions, like, okay, we can choose to teach our kids about God, about Jesus, about everything that he wants, or culture is going to teach them. And so as our kids are going farther and farther away from the church, man, we've got to be teaching the next generation, because without that, they're going to be looking for a purpose that they will not find, because they have not been taught who Jesus is.
Yeah. I would agree with that statement completely. I'll share quickly, a lot of the people from Hope City know my testimony, especially the Gurners, but quickly I'll share, I was a neighborhood kid who grew up pretty unchurched and just in the area of Jacobsville. Side note, that's why it's so cool that now I'm doing all this youth in Jacobsville. Like I'm overseeing that. That's just full circle for me. But anyway, I was unchurched, and then like you said, you're going to learn from somewhere. So luckily, I was lucky enough that a friend brought me to Hope City, which was then Gethsemane, through their kids program. Yeah. So I got to learn from a church. I learned biblical principles and things, but also at the same time, I was still hanging around with all my neighborhood friends and still doing all these things, learning from them as well. So that leads me into my next question. Could you just discuss, in your opinion, what you think the importance of mentorship is and guidance in youth as a whole, but specifically Gen Z, right? Because you're just saying, what was the thing you said? It's the most like unchurched youth.
Mm-hmm. It's the most unchurched generation. Yeah.
Which is crazy. And we can do something about that though. So
yeah.
Can you just discuss the importance, in your opinion, of mentorship and guidance, like I said, to youth as a whole, but specifically Gen Z? Like how can we help influence their faith for the better?
Yeah. Gosh, I think that's like everything right now, because that's what's cool about this generation, though, as I think this generation is more in touch with their feelings than any other generation. And this generation actually wants something that's real more than any other generation, which is prime markers. Like if they're searching for something real, like that means that they want something that they have not found. Like they've tried a lot of stuff that does not satisfy them, right? Like they look a lot like the woman at the well, where it's like Jesus is like, hey, look, you'll drink this and you'll thirst no more. Like students are genuinely craving for something real. They're just looking to find it. And that's why like mentorship and having someone who's there is so important. It changes everything. And so that's really where we see, when Paul was a mentor to Timothy, like you see Jesus was a mentor to the disciples, right? Like Elijah, Elisha, there was mentorship there, right? Because in order for someone to take that baton to, if you want to get really churchy, take that mantle, like take whatever that is, right? You have to be able to set an example for them, right? And that's why you see in Timothy, like 1 Timothy 4:11-12, he writes, teach these things and insist that everyone learn them. Don't let anyone think less of you because of you are young, but be an example to all the believers in what you say, in the way you live, in your love, in your faith, and in your purity, right? And so that's always used like in every youth message of all time. When you're talking to students, it's like, be the example.
Bible verse was that?
That was 1 Timothy 4:11-12.
Okay, I just want to put it in the comments. Sorry.
Yeah.
What were you saying?
No, that's great. And so 1 Timothy 4:11-12, like you literally see that Timothy is being encouraged, right? Like, and he's encouraging the believers, don't let anyone look down on you because you are young. So youth pastors love to say, it's like, students, don't let anyone, but be the example, do all of that. But the problem is that like, they can't be the example unless someone sets the example. Right. And so you have all these students who are trying to figure out what it means to follow Jesus. And so I think that's what's also hard about it, too. And I think that's why it can be hard to be a mentor in a lot of worlds, is because you have kids who are 12 to 18 but they're spiritual babies. And so we see kids who are older making bad decisions. I think that's why people struggle with teenagers so much, is we see them making bad decisions and we're like, well, they should know better. Well, I was like, well, they're spiritual babies. So they have no idea because no one set the example for them. Right. And so in order for someone to grow to be where they are, they need someone to show them and lead them, and not do it by just like correction, because that's important. And the Bible does speak towards rebuke, and iron sharpens iron. But through love and building a relationship, then you can see a transformation in their life. And so everyone needs a mentor within that process. And I think everyone agrees with that statement, right? That everyone needs a mentor in a process. I think what people disagree on is what that actually looks like, right? Especially with teenagers, is because there's a reason why one of the hardest places to get people to serve in is with teenagers. It's because people love the idea of the next generation and pouring into the next generation, and churches will say that the next generation is the future. However, they very rarely do anything about it. Right. I know that sounds very mean, but also people vote with their feet. And if people really believe in the next generation, there would be a lot more people serving in churches in those areas. And so
Chris is preaching. Okay.
And so I think we get to a point where we have to ask the question. A lot of people think, well, I'm not well equipped enough to serve with teenagers, right? Like I have teenagers in my own home, is what a lot of parents will say. And they're like, I don't even want to deal with mine. And now you're wanting me to deal with others, right? And so that's where I look a lot of times. I think we have a very Pharisee approach when it comes to teenagers instead of having a heart like Jesus. And it's something I wrestle with a lot because you can pour and pour and pour into students. And when they do something dumb, you're like, why aren't you changing yet? And there's actually a really incredible book. It's Gospel-Centered Kids Ministry. It's by Brian Dembowczyk. He has a crazy last name, but it's not a super long book, but it's so good. And one of the opening things that he does is he talks about this crazy statistic, right? And these are for kids who are in church. He says if you take 10 kids, right, as soon as they turn 18, 7 out of 10 kids will leave the church, right? Out of that 7, 5 of them will come back once they have kids of their own, but 2 will never return. Those aren't unchurched kids. Those are kids who are growing up at Hope City. Those are kids who are growing up at the Hills. Those are kids who are growing up in the church that you go to. And the scary thing is that 70% of them will leave when they turn 18. And so he starts to ask the question, why? Why is it that kids are leaving in droves out of the church when we know that within the church, like you can find your purpose, you can find people, you find everything that you're needing, a relationship with Jesus that saves and transforms your life? Why is it that people, they're in a place where they can find life and life to the full, and yet they're running the exact opposite way?
Right.
And one of the big things that he talks about within that book is because so often children's ministries and youth ministries focus on behavior modification instead of heart transformation. And that is probably one of the biggest problems that personally I see when it comes to being a mentor to students, is that parents want to see change in kids' actions. But when you just target a kid's actions, you're going to lose them completely. That's why kids are running from the church. They're like, okay, you're just telling me to be a good person, and that's good. Teaching them rules is good, but it never changes their heart. And they're like, it's not fulfilling what my heart desires. That's what the Pharisees did. They followed every rule perfectly. They were the most goodest person ever. And I know that's not a word. I was homeschooled, let it slide. But they followed everything to a T. And yet it still wasn't enough. That's why Jesus still had to come, right? And so I think a lot of times as churches, as mentors, as leaders, right, we will set the example, but our setting example looks like just changing their behavior, right? No, you can't talk like that in church. Oh, no. You can't tell us that lifestyle that you're living. Jesus doesn't approve of that, which is true, right? Like you can't be going out and partying. You can't be listening to this music. You can't. And all these kids are hearing is that, one, then I have to be perfect when I come into church. One, then God doesn't really love where I'm currently at, the sinful, broken human, and therefore they have to wall up like a shell of perfection. When Jesus was the exact opposite, right? Like you see Jesus, when the woman was caught in the act of adultery, she gets thrown right down in the middle. And as she's there, deserving of her punishment, because the law is very clear that if you're caught in the act of adultery, you deserve death, right? And so all the Pharisees, all the leaders are there, and they were right. She did deserve that. But Jesus did something different. In the moment, first he protected her, and then he corrected her.
Right.
First, when she was there, first stops all of the stones, right? You without sin, throw the first stone, everybody leaves. He protects her in the moment. He doesn't say that her behavior is correct, though. He's like, where are your accusers? She says, none are there. I don't accuse you either. Now he says, now go and sin no more, right? So there was a relationship that was built before it caused her to change. There was a heart transformation that then caused an entire attitude, a behavior change. And that's what we've got to understand for our students. I think that's what's so hard for people when they struggle with teenagers. Is like, Chris, you're letting kids in church who cuss. I'm like, yes. You're letting kids in church who are just on their phones all the time during service. Yes. Have you seen what they put on social media? Yes, I realize that the finger that they're holding up is probably not the right one. I get that, right? Like they're telling everyone that they're number one, but they shouldn't be doing that, right? Like I get all of those things. And I know behind the scenes what they're doing at school, the people who they're wanting to fight. Like I get all of that. But if I just target their behavior, I will lose them. But if I target the heart, I'll also get the behavior as well. Why? Because Jesus changes the heart. And when we follow Jesus, he starts to change our behaviors too.
Right. Yeah, and that's why, and I believe this is the same with you, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but here at Hope City, we don't have youth leaders, we have youth coaches that help with the
Yeah.
youth. And the idea behind that is we're not here as dictators, or like you were saying, you don't want to necessarily, of course, we want to teach kids right from wrong. Like, don't take that the wrong way, everybody watching. But you don't want to say, here are these hard, fast rules, because now you're just going to have a bunch of teens that, like you were saying, put up this fake persona, this fake shell. But as coaches, it's our job to walk beside them. It's our job to walk with them. It's our job to, yes, point them in the right direction. Yes, correct them, but do it with love and do it from a stance that we're here to help you and we're not perfect either.
Right.
I'm sure you and I both still struggle with some of the things we preach about because we're humans. You know, we are subject to the sin of flesh just like the teens are. We just might have a few more years on them. But at the end of the day, we still fall to sin nature sometimes. Of course, we're made new. Of course, we're new creations in God. But like I taught the kids last Wednesday, we are a spirit, we have a soul, we live in a body. So because our spirit is made new, because our spirit is renewed, that's great. But we still have flesh, and we still have to deal with flesh nature. So it's our job is, like the whole point of all this was, it's our job to walk beside them as coaches, right? Not leaders. Because if everyone's a leader, first of all, not to get on a tangent, if everyone's a leader, no one's a leader at that point. But also, coaches, we're here to help you. And like I was just saying, I'm sure you as well as I still struggle with some of the things that we are preaching to the teens, right?
Yeah.
So because of that, I do want to just get into like, can you give any examples of how youth ministry has impacted your life? But then also if you have any like students that come to your mind from recent years or any time, just any examples about how youth ministry as a whole, whether it be you as the youth minister, or when you were a teenager, when you were a kid in youth ministry, is there any time at all that has been impactful to your life because of youth ministry?
Yeah. I think for me personally, like growing up as a student, because that's the crazy thing. So our lead pastor, Daryl Marin, was my youth pastor growing up. Right. And so there was a season that like, obviously he got a different job. I went off to Texas, all this other stuff. And it's crazy how God like brought us back together for that. And so the impact of who I am, like you can just mark it with like the different people that God put in our life. Literally, we had our speaker at our youth retreat this weekend. His name was Jason Alvarado. And literally, I remember hearing him as a student. And like, even though that there wasn't tons of conversation, I can pinpoint the moments and things that he said that made an impact in my life, right? So I'm only where I am today because of the people and the people who poured into me, right? Like I'll say that I'm a product of my mother's prayers. I'm a product of the people who surround me. Like you are a product of who you're surrounded by, the voices that you like choose to speak into you and that drive you. And so for me, I'm where I am because God put the right people around me, and I chose to listen to the right people in my life too. And I think for students, man, that is so huge. Like I have a buddy who I had grown up with in Florida, and in our youth ministry, incredibly, unchurched. Like he grew up in a single parent household. He had to be dad for like his siblings and stuff like that. And so when he started coming around church, him and I graduated the same year. I didn't even know we went to the same high school together until like longer down the line when we're in church together. And, like he was living like every lifestyle. He was a typical teenager. He was an awesome dude, but like cussing, living whatever life, whatever it is. And then Jesus got a hold of his life. And it wasn't, I think like earlier this year, God has changed his life so much. He actually opened for Lecrae. When cool. Lecrae came to Tampa, and so that's what's so crazy is we don't get to see sometimes the end result of what God does. And that's what's so hard, especially about youth ministry, is you're literally just planting seeds with kids and you don't know how it's going to change. But sometimes God lets you see even like a tiny thing of it. And it's so cool to see. Like we had one student last year, he had grown up in church, awesome kid. He's one of the kindest kids you'll ever see. And I remember after the fall retreat, he's like, Chris, I think I need to figure out this Jesus thing just for me. Like my parents are believers, like all of that. And I've come to church, but like, I need to start reading the Bible and see where like this means to me. I can't live off my parents' faith anymore. Right. So you have that one end of the spectrum, right? Where you have kids who have been raised in church, but then on the flip side of it, like, I think it was like almost 2 years ago when we were doing United Nights at Hope City. We had one kid who just showed up 2 hours early. He's sitting on the curb at Hope City. We're trying to set up. He has 2 monsters sitting there. And he's just like, hey, can I help with something? I'm like, shh. sure, man. And like the
Yep.
kid was only there because the girl that he liked at the time was there. He had no want to even love Jesus. He just wanted to love
Right.
the girl that he liked, right? And so if you fast forward to where we are now, like the kid still struggles, kid still like has things that he's working through, but at the same time, light bulbs have been clicking on in his head, right? And so, man, the kid has had a rough life. Like he's experienced death, he's experienced pain, like drug, like alcohol in his family, like everything that like really could go wrong. And that's what's so scary is when you see a kid on the outside who is struggling, who is hurting, we don't get to see underneath. Like I was telling students this weekend, right? Like people are icebergs, right? When you look at an iceberg, you see 10% on the surface. It's how
Right.
they look, it's how they act, it's how they talk, all those other things. But with an iceberg, 90% of it is actually underwater. Man, that's every student's thought, emotion, like home life, like all of those things you don't see really makes up that 10%. Right. And that's why I love so much about God as we see in First Samuel as Samuel's picking the new king of Israel. He's like going through the sons of Jesse and he's like, what about this one? He's big. He's like, nope, this one. Nope, nope, nope. And he's like, you got any more kids? And then he brings out David, who wasn't even thought of in the first place. Like that's how looked down on David was. His
Right.
own father kept him in a field, and then literally he gets caught up. And then God says, I don't look at outward appearance like everyone else does. I look at the heart. Um, and so I think it's so key for us is that like, man, if we can get to the core of a kid, if we can get to a heart, man, that changes everything. And so like that kid right now, like he's like making good choices for himself. Like he's going to therapy, he's going to things that he's going there and he's like, hey, I think these are things that God's speaking to me. I'm like, dude, keep on going into that. Keep on praying, keep on doing it. Be faithful with the little God's given you, man. He's going to show you draw near to God. He's going to draw near to you. And you see things like that too. There's a kid that like literally in the series that we were talking about stuff, like she had come up to me after service and she's like, Chris, I was sexually assaulted a few years ago. And like I've talked about with my parents, like we're working through that, like I'm doing well, but I never understood why he would do that. Like why that kid would do that to me. And when you were talking, you talked about how hurt people, right? And because of sin, how it warps the idea and how culture has taught us that people are almost playthings. She's like, it would make sense why he would do that. And because I understand, man, I feel like I can forgive him now,
Yep.
And
That's
so,
huge.
yeah. And you're sitting in those moments and I didn't know I was going to have that conversation at the end of
Right.
service. I was like, let's go play basketball. And she's
Right.
like, hey, I'm like, oh man, but it's crazy to see how like God uses such imperfect people and his message still goes through, right? Like whenever, God's word goes out, it doesn't return void, and
Right.
so I think God has really been teaching me a lot that like I really have to stop with my idea of what perfection looks like or what I want a service to look like.
Right.
Because if not, it will ruin my mindset and then I won't be good to anybody. And what God is doing, I may not see it, but it doesn't mean He's not doing something in our
Right.
student. I was talking to you earlier about the fall retreat that we went on, and man, there's such cool life change moments. Like literally, the last day we're doing like a testimonies, or it's the first year we've ever done it. I was like, hey, if God did something in your life this week, freed you from something, or just like, man, you're struggling with this and you need that, come up and let's just share it. And so there are 7 students that come up, and when I first did it, like all the kids are sitting in their chairs, like they're like, no one wanted to come up, and I'm just like, oh, this is going to be a train wreck. And then literally there was this one kid. He just comes up, he just walks up and he starts sharing them because of one kid. You had all these kids come up, boom, 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 right after. And like you just see, it's like, yes, God is making breakthrough. He's changing this, all of it, right? And then literally we're talking about it's like right after that, like 2 hours later, then you see like sin and that old way of life come right back into kids, and you're like, oh, this is so frustrating.
Yeah.
And dude, youth ministry has a way, if you're not careful, of just like beating you down. Because I've been in a season right now because of like what my expectation is versus like I think what God is wanting to do, it is so easy that you can just get so disappointed, right? Especially with teenagers, because they're going to make mistakes and it's repeated mistakes. And you're like, oh, we talked about this last week. Don't go back to that guy. He's not good
Right.
for you. It's like, well, we got back together and I'm like, oh no, why? Or it's just a repeated behavior because life got difficult again. And
Right.
see all of those repetition things and it wears you down because you're wanting to see the life change happen on a timetable that may not be on God's.
Right.
And that's okay. Or you're wanting to see things grow on your own time when it's not God's, and you have to be faithful with what he's given you. And man, it's
Right.
tough. And I've gotten to a season myself where honestly, like depression has just been hard. Like there was a few weeks ago where honestly it was just tough for me to get out of bed because I felt like a failure, like so much.
Mm,
There's so much that breaks down to it. Is that a lie of the enemy? Absolutely. Like there's so much that goes into that. Like overworking myself to try to make a lot of things happen, and then just feeling so defeated, and all of that trickles. And it's so tough. And part of it is just like trying to live up to an expectation that like is it just something I've thrown on myself versus, okay, man, where has God given me? Let me be faithful with this, and that's enough. And honestly, in the
right.
season I've kind of been in, all I've like said is that I am not enough, but God is more than enough, and that is always enough.
Right.
Uh, and like, and it's really comes back to a lot of pride, like within all of us. Like we take pride in what we do. We take pride in our kids. We take pride in the jobs we have. We take pride in a lot of stuff. And the problem with that is that like unknowingly, because all of us are so blind to our pride, is that we think that we've got this or whatever it is. And Chris, that was a good message. That's going to change the student's heart. No. God changes his student heart, and I'm just lucky enough that he speaks through me to do it. And
Right.
when that gets switched, like we think it all relies on us, man, that's a dangerous place to be in youth ministry. I know that kind of goes off of kind of what we're talking about a little bit,
No,
but
that's
we just
great.
got a rabbit hole just a little bit.
Yep. No, that's okay. Because even though we're talking about the importance of youth ministry, some of the people, well, most of the people watching right now are not youth. So maybe, just talking
Yeah.
about things like that, they can get something from it. We were talking before we started, something I've been really dealing with in the youth ministry is numbers. And
Hmm.
ultimately, like I was saying, what's important is that I'm sowing into the lives of the kids that we have, right? We might have 7 students show up on a Wednesday night, but that's also, even though I want bigger numbers, even though I want more students, I want to lead more students to Christ. Also, now I got to look at this like an opportunity for mentorship, right? Like now there's 7 students that I can one-on-one spend the entire service with. I could literally sit down if I wanted with these 7 students and go over like who has questions, what are you dealing with? Dealing with lust, dealing with this, dealing with that. Oh, you've been smoking weed at home? Cool. Like now we have this real intimate thing going on. But like you were just saying, I always get caught up in my mind of like, especially, well, the Hills, you guys have what, like 60, 70 kids on a Wednesday?
Yeah.
Yep, so that's awesome. But of course, you're still, because this is just how it works, you're still also in the mindset of like, I'd love some more teens. Like, what am I doing wrong? Right? So anyone, whether you're in youth ministry or this can apply to any aspect of your life, you have to remember that even though you're always wanting more, you can still do something with what you got, especially with God on your side, right? So
Right.
just, I didn't mean to detour the conversation, but I felt led. If anybody's watching and you're in a position where you're saying like, what I have is great, but I want more. Like, God, what's going on? I want more. First of all, anything you ask in faith, you will receive. Second of all, 2 Corinthians 2:14, thanks be to God who always manifests you and triumphs you in Christ Jesus. But also look at what you got and think, how can I impact with what's going on right now? So, segue, whenever I was in youth group, spiritual leaders, spiritual fathers were huge for me. So any time where there was a smaller youth group or things were a little more intimate, that was really, really good for me because I got to build those relationships with people I really looked up to. So even though I'm in a spot now as the youth leader, like leading the ministry, of being like, I wish we had more kids. I want to impact more youth. Like, why do I not have 100 youth here? Like, we've got a cool program. We've got these cool things. I think I'm a decent preacher, whatever. So, like, why don't we have a bigger youth ministry going on? But also, come back to mentorship, I have to remind myself of when I was a teen, how important that one-on-one time was with a mentor, with a youth pastor, with someone of that nature. So it's just really cool to not get caught up in, like, thinking about numbers and then keeping it mentorship minded, right?
Right.
But that being said, I do want to ask you, in your opinion, of course, what are some unique?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many challenges, and this is what is so interesting. I was talking to someone about it, is that like every generation, there's always sin. It just comes in a new packaging, right? And so I think for when it comes to the core of it, people want to be known, people want to be loved, people want to be accepted, right? And so it just looks different in every generation. And so for students, like right now, identity is such a thing in crisis. It's like, who am I? Do I matter? Am I valuable? Right. And that's why like ministry is so important, because Jesus says yes to all of those things. We're created in the image of God. So there's your identity right there. Ephesians 2:10 says that you are God's masterpiece, right? We're fearfully and wonderfully made. Do you matter? Yes. God has a plan and a purpose for your life, and that identity is only found in him. Right. So you have a whole generation of seeking something that's trying to be real. And so it's like, okay, is it drugs and alcohol? No. Is it sex? Okay, no, it's not in the correct confines of what God has created. So it's leaving me empty. Right. Is it in this relationship? Is it in that? No. Is it in social media and trying to look like everyone else and have vanity and seeking that? No, it still leaves me empty. And so what I think is so interesting about this generation, it honestly just reminds me of the prodigal son. Is that like they're literally searching the world and it still hasn't filled them. And so they're trying to find something, which is so great that they're seeking, And so I think the other big thing for this generation, besides just their identity of who they are, that Satan wants nothing more than to destroy, right? He comes to steal, kill, and destroy. He prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. He wants to destroy the identity that God has given. Right. So when people struggle with insecurity, they've also got to realize that it's connected to your identity, and Satan's attacking your identity, which is why we struggle with insecurities. It's because he's trying to destroy what God created. But that's a whole nother conversation for another time. I think the other big thing that students in this day and age struggle with more than I think a lot of other people is because emotions are so talked about. That mental health issues, anxiety, depression, like all of that, it has come so much to the forefront, which is cool for a couple of reasons. One, I think this generation is a lot more transparent than previous generations. Like I don't ever remember my parents talking about like a lot of like stuff. Like I remember a few times I've talked to my dad, because my parents didn't grow up as believers. And I was like, Dad, what's your testimony? Or like, you need to share your testimony. Like over the years, I've been able to hear more and more. And I was like, Dad, you need to share your testimony, what he's done. And he's like, oh, Chris, the past is the past. The Lord's redeemed me. We don't need to talk about that. And I was like, what you're saying is true, but that's why Paul talks about, it's like, if I'm going to boast of anything, I'll boast of my weakness. Like Psalm talks about, like, let the redeemed, like we're getting to share stories of what God's done. And so like with their students, they have no problem sharing the struggles that they deal with. They just have no clue how to fix them.
Yeah.
Or it's even like a hot topic. It's trendy to say that I struggle like someone else does. And so we find our students in a place where like they're in hurt, but they're stuck in this cycle of I'm struggling, I'm hurting, another thing hurts me, but I don't know how to deal with it. So they're just in a constant loop of hurt, pain, cycle. And so our students are in a place where they're looking for something, they're seeking who they really are, and their emotions are on the forefront, but they don't know what to do with any of that stuff, right? So that's why I think a lot of Christians, especially when we look on it and we see kids who are struggling with like homosexuality, transgender, like all of this other type of stuff, we're like, oh my gosh, how could someone struggle with this? Still sin, it's just coming in a different packaging. And so how did God treat us when we were stuck in sin, right? Scripture tells us that his kindness leads us to repentance, right? How did the father treat his son who had turned after he had wasted everything? He was waiting there at the door, said, let's throw a party, my son is home, right? And so I think for even parents who are listening to this, I think a lot of times once our kids get to teenagers, we feel like that it's too late. My kid's already going off living this lifestyle, doing all of these other things. Like, what can you start doing now? It'd be praying, right? The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. And a lot of times when things are out of our control, we're like, I don't know what to do. Well, it's a great time to turn to the one who can do all things. And I think the other thing is a lot of times as parents, we want to, shelter our kids from any pain that they'll experience within the world. And I think that's what's interesting about the story of the prodigal son. The father's there and he knows what's best for the son. He's like, don't go out in the world. You're not going to find it. But he's like, no, this is what I need. And he's like, okay. He's like, if you're going to go live your fill, let sin have its full thing and you get sick to your stomach. So then you'll return. I think a lot of times we want to shelter our kids from that pain. And in that process, like we're not letting, the actions of their decisions actually take full root so that kindness, when they wise up, because it says in scripture that when he's in that pig's pen, then he remembered what his father's house was and he returned back home. It was at his lowest moment, he remembered how good it was. And I think a lot of times, like we're seeing a lot of students who are seeking for something and they need someone who are just going to be there, be consistent in their lives and love them. And that doesn't mean that kids just get to have full reign in the house. There's clear rules, there's clear
Sure.
structure, all those things, because we need structure as humans. But also at the same time, like, how patient is God with us when we sin? And it's so hard to do, but how patient can we be in their struggle? Because here's the beautiful thing as a parent. If your kid is struggling still in the home, you still have a way to still instruct them. Right? They're not out of the house yet. They're struggling with drugs. Okay. I don't love that they're doing that, but how can we have a conversation and continue to lead them in that? Because eventually they'll be out of the home on their own. And if they're going to fail, I'd much rather have them fail in the home where there's someone who's still loving, who is still kind and helping lead in that way.
Right.
Yeah, but I think those are some of the unique things that students are struggling with, is their identity, mental health issues, all of that is coming to the surface. And I think the other big thing is, man, just single parent homes or divorced homes. Statistics show that 50% of all marriages end in divorce, and that includes the church. Right. And so literally, like when we were there this weekend, we were doing this thing called the line game. And I was like, if you come from a broken home, come put your foot on the line. And almost every single kid came and put their foot on the line. And so you have all of these kids trying to figure out affirmation, whether it's from their father, from their mother, from the parent that's not in the house, or they're having to pick up the sins of their father and or mother, and then they're trying to walk through it with those scars. Well, no person is ever perfect. Like my parents were not perfect, but I grew up in a Christian household where both parents were there. And it's so different from a lot of other stories. Like my wife's story is different, like grew up in a divorced household, right? And so then how do you balance both of those things? And so, kids are getting the brunt of a generation that has passed down things, right? And that's, as I brought up First Kings earlier, you see that within every, king that was there, the sin that he had was then inherited and then magnified by the next. And you're talking about these generational things that are being passed down to students right now that they're having to try to deal with. Like the amount of kids, I can tell you that their parents are in prison right now. And they're like, I don't know if my father actually loves me. Dude, you would have been shocked when I asked the question, come put your foot on the line if you question whether your parents love you or not, the amount of kids that came and put them on the line. They have no clue, right? They're like, I don't think my parents love me. I don't think they're proud of me. I don't think anything. And they're just looking for someone to approve them, right? Which is why you find all of these kids getting into all of these areas of things that we look at. We're like, why would they get involved with that crowd? Why would they get involved with this and with that? It's because it's something that actually accepts them, even if it's the wrong thing.
Right.
Right. And their identity is completely being twisted because they look at leaders, they look at parents as the example of who God is, and they see a bunch of people who are judgmental, hateful, and don't love them nor care for them or accept them. And they say, well, if that's what the people who say love Jesus look like, then that must be how God is and how he treats me too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge thing for me. Of course, our mission statement at Hope City is to share the goodness of God, to bring hope and transformation in Christ. And whenever I stepped into this position, I was basically praying like, God, what am I to do here? Like, what is the culture that is supposed to be for Hope City's youth? And love is huge. Like, it's almost like a joke where anytime I preach, it always comes back to God loves you. Because to me, at least, it feels like a generation ahead of us was really big on, like, don't sin. We have a very stern father. God will smite you. Like, the whole, like, rule with an iron fist kind of type of God. And now we have this old generation who is struggling to feel loved, like you were. Hey, you there?
I'm back.
Hey, is the live stream, are you guys here? So, quick, boom, there you are. Quick thing, basically what's going on is last night at Hope City, someone hit a pole right behind the church, and there's some stuff going on, some work being done, so I'm sure internet's being messed with. But hi, welcome back, everybody. We have about 10 minutes left, so I want to finish my thought just in case you missed it, and then I have one final question for you. But basically, summing thoughts is that love is important. Teaching students all about love is important. Okay, looks like we're still good. Sorry, now I'm all like, is the stream unstable? Um, but finally, I just want to ask you, are there any strategies or programs that you have found to be like successful in engaging students? Like, is there,
Mhm.
are there any things that you specifically know work from your experience when it comes to maybe not just getting students in church, but then keeping them in church? Do you have any
Yeah,
examples of that?
I think everyone's always trying to look for the next big thing. But the problem is there's nothing new under the sun, and so I think that's the hard part is that like you can package it differently. And like what's actually really funny is I'm actually doing the things that like my youth pastor used to do, right? And so what's so funny is now his son is in our youth ministry and he's gone home to like Daryl and he's been like, Dad, dude, Chris did this super cool thing, man. And he's like, what? He's like, you realize I did that for Chris. And then he calls me and he's like, my son thinks you're a genius and you're not. And so then he showed him all the stuff that like we used to do back in the day. And he's like, wait a minute, Chris is just copying you. And he's like, that's right, son. He's like, Chris is a fraud.
Well, we're all
You
just
know,
copying
um,
Jesus.
and and so literally there's nothing new under the sun. And so you can I think what's key for every ministry, always hitting up like some sort of summer camp, right? Where kids can get away, doing some fall retreat where you can focus and get them like on that is always huge. And I think our students are so relational. Having an element of a small group where they're sitting down, sharing life with one another, being in community is so huge. I think this is because of COVID. I think because of what students struggle with, which is anxiety, depression. It's one of the most isolated groups. Also because we're on the phone. That's what's so crazy about technology. And maybe I should have said this in the last question you asked, is that students will feel connected to someone who does not know that they exist.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, oh, I know who Mr. Beast is. I know Markiplier. Like, I know all of these guys. They have no clue who those students are, and they don't care about them. It's just another subscriber. And so they will be so emotionally connected to someone who doesn't know them. And so it's the most isolated, like, teenage group ever. And so getting them in a group where they also see people who struggle the same that they do and getting them in community is beautiful. I think the enemy is so smart and he is so good that he has isolated people to make them think that they're the only ones who struggle with what they're facing. So I think those two things are huge, but really when it comes down to it, I think for anyone who is in ministry, having coaches, leaders, volunteers, whatever you want to call them, is the lifeblood of what you're going to do. You can have really crappy worship, you can have really crappy preaching, but if your kids are connected to a leader, that will keep them coming back because it's someone who knows me, it's someone who loves me, someone who knows what's going on in my life and is there for me. When everything has hit the fan, that person is there.
Yep.
Right. And so like I always tell our leaders, I'm like, man, what can we do that I trust like leaders? I'm like, what can we do better than anyone else? We need to know our kids' names. We need to know what's going on in their lives and we need to be checking up on them. Man, like if you do, kids are like, I'm always going to come back to Hills Youth because they know who I am. I'm wanting to be there and they know every bad thing about me and they still love me. Right. Like I'm going to be back at that place. And I think for, anyone who's doing church or youth ministry, I think that's probably one of the biggest things that you can do is I can tell you the growth of like your like area, probably by the leaders that you have and the leaders, how well you've trained them. Because if the youth pastor is the main focus and kids only talk with him, you're going to stifle your ministry because you can only reach so many people. Who is it? It's Doug Fields. He wrote a book talking about your first 2 years in youth ministry. And one of the statistics that people throw out is that every leader can reach about 5 students. After that, their like potential is kind of maxed out. Right. And so you can kind of say, oh, if I want a youth ministry of 100 kids, all right, let's divide that by 5. How many youth leaders do I need to have in the room? Right. And so that's where I look at it and I go, okay, nothing's new under the sun. Like we've done events. We did something called Youth Fest, which was awesome. Right. We had tons of giveaways. We had Kona Ice here. It was a really big Compel night, which I think is also important too. Like, man, how are you telling your students that evangelism is super important? Right. You can do something where you do like giveaways and all of that. But like through that entire month and leading up to it, we had cards like, hey, go pass this at your school. Go be doing those things. You need to invite your friends. Whoever invites the most people, I'll give you AirPods, whatever it is. And so that night we had 198 kids show up, which is bonkers, which is so cool. Right. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, like that's amazing. But it's like the most depressing thing is the week after and none of those kids come back.
Yeah.
And so that's where I look at it. There's so many events which are so important for so many levels because it gets kids in a routine that like I want to be at that place because we're always doing something where I can be included. And it all goes back to the heart. It all goes back to being wanted, accepted, loved, all of those other things. So that's where I go back to like you can do tons of events out the wazoo. You can feed kids out the wazoo and it's all great. It'll bring kids in, but still until they're connected with someone, you're going to be doing a lot of things in vain.
Right. I would agree with that. Well, I don't have anything else to go over. I know we're running up on our time. First, thank you for being on today. I
Yeah,
hope
for sure.
people got some stuff out of it. Just a reminder to everybody that tomorrow we have Adam Otten on, and it is Wild Wednesday. Chris, for you, in case you didn't know, Wild Wednesday is basically this, but it's a little more on the wild side. So things are a little more loose. I don't know how it's going to get much more relaxed than the conversation we just had, but I'm sure that Adam will find a way. But so we have Adam Otten on tomorrow, and then we have our own Mark Gerner. He's our family pastor here at Hope City. He'll be on Thursday, and he's going to talk. Basically, I have the same questions for all three of my guests this week because I think everyone's going to have different perspectives, different answers, and of course, spirit-led. I'm sure we will get different things out of them. So if you watch today, please watch again tomorrow and Thursday. Share this with anybody. Share this with anybody who has youth-age students. Of course, I'd love for them to come to Hope City, but you can also send them to the Hills. They have a great program. What's important is that they get into church and they learn about Jesus, right? So
Absolutely.
do you have anything you want to close with, or do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Gosh, I've said a lot of stuff. Sorry, Adam, if you're still watching that I've used a lot of your Bible stories. You put that in the comments, so my bad. But I'm sure the Lord will direct you to some other stuff. But no, I think that's it, man. I mean, like youth ministry, kids ministry is so important. And there's a quote or just a quick one-liner. It's like, I'd rather much teach my kids before I have to reach them.
Yeah.
We're in a place where like we need to start teaching our kids what it looks like to have a real relationship with Jesus and not follow a bunch of book of rules. Because if we can teach them that, man, dude, like if you look at every historical movement, it has all been done by the young generation. That's where like it kind of starts off to, right? And as we're talking, like I don't know if you've seen the movie Jesus Revolution, about Greg Lowry's story, man.
Yeah, it's a
but
good
like
movie.
all of if you haven't seen the movie, it's a fantastic movie because I think a lot of it parallels to actually this generation so well.
Yeah, I think so as well.
Where you see kind of in the 60s and 70s, people were just searching for something. And so it's like the whole love movement, which you could argue kind of looks like love is love, like we're all love, right? But what is the definition of that? And so people are trying to find that, and they're trying to find these like experiences, and they even equate it to a spiritual experience. So I'm going to try this drug so I can experience that. And I think for us, students are looking for something, and it wasn't until Jesus showed up on the scene, this whole wave of this young group of people, that zeal and that fire started something. And I know before my mom had passed, like she would always pray that revival would come, that she's like, Chris, it's coming soon. And I'm looking at, I was like, what does it look like for a group of young people who have really like experienced that, like, no, it's Jesus, and then really run with that. I think that's what you're finding in this generation of kids who have tried a lot of stuff and it hasn't worked out. And so, man, like that's where I look at like almost like Paul, like he was so anti-Jesus, but once he found it, he was like, oh, no, there's nothing else that compares. And so something that's cool, we have a group of students who get dropped off, who come, and like for them, they're like not really about Jesus, but I just heard a report from their leader. It's like, Chris, since they've been coming, they've actually been praying for meals at school. Like they've been praying at school, like starting that. We've got one girl who's been like trying to get FCA started back up since COVID hit. And like over at Harrison, and like, dude, you have all these kids who it's like, man, all it's going to take is one spark, like for Jesus to move. And these kids, when they find it, they're not going to let go of it because that's what they've really been searching for. And so, man, light shines brightest in the darkest. So if you've got a teenager, if you're in youth ministry, like don't take for granted for what you're doing, right? Like we got to have the same mindset of what Jesus had, which is literally when he saw all the people out there, he's like, man, these are people, sheep without a shepherd, and he had compassion on them. You have a lot of hurt, broken, and messy students, and what should our response be? It should be compassion.
Yeah, that's awesome. I just appreciate your heart. I appreciate you being on here today. I've got a lot from it. And of course, I'd love to have you on again. Maybe this is the beginning of having Chris on Hope for You. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I am sorry if the audio gets a little wonky. In case I went too fast over it earlier, basically, we had a car hit a pole right by our church last night, so they're working on that today, so our internet's been kind of going in and out. So if you are missing a few minutes of this broadcast, I am so sorry. Come back again tomorrow. We're going to keep going. But again, this has been Hope for You. Let me give it to my solo camera. Bam. If you would like to sow into Hope for You, you can do that. We do this completely for free for you. I am not expecting money. I'm not asking for money. However, if God has put it on your heart to sow into Hope for You, we provide a way for you to do so. So in the description of this video, you can click that. It'll take you to our website. It'll take you to our giving tab. If you feel led to give into Hope for You, if you feel like you got anything out of this and you want to sow into that, that is always a great idea. So we just provide the opportunity for you to do so. Again, thank you, Chris, so much for being on today. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for listening. This has been Hope for You. I'm going to sign off here. Chris, if you can hang out for just a second, I'm going to end this stream for everybody. So, bye-bye. See you tomorrow. We're going to have Adam Otten on and be here, and we love you, and it's going to be wild, and it's going to be fun, and amen. Okay. Okay. Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.